What constitutes female African identity? Religion, motherhood, maybe resilience, abuse, poverty? What does it mean to be an African woman? Think about it regardless of who you are. How do you view us? What do you see when you look at me? As I've matured, these questions have constantly appeared in the back of my mind. As an 18-year-old Mozambican who has only known the warmth of her mother, living in a Western country has made me realize how much of my life has been hidden in the dark. I realize how differently women are perceived in the different parts of the globe, and how cultural roots inherently influence our beings. I've realized how oblivious we Africans can be on issues related to human rights abuses of African women and girls. In many African villages, awareness, access to information, and knowledge are often scarce commodities, leaving us with no choice to rely on what others tell or provide us, rather than making our own informed decisions about our rights. In the rich tapestry of African cultures, traditions have woven stories of resilience, community, and identity. However, as we stand at the crossroads of tradition and abuse, it becomes crucial to question where we draw the line. How do we navigate the delicate balance between preserving our cultural heritage and safeguarding the rights and well-beings of African women? I was raised by resilient women, my grandmother and my mother. These two individuals have faced the rippling effects of generational trauma, often interpreting it as a cultural norm and tradition, consequently normalizing these harmful practices. My grandmother had 6 children during the transition to independence in Mozambique, and throughout the 16 years of the civil war that devastated the country. They grew up during a time of famine, and despite being married, my grandfather offered minimal support, leaving my grandmother to single-handedly care for her 6 children. Growing up, it was only my mother and I. Although she was an exceptional mother in many ways, she was also very busy most of the time, working hard so we could have shelter, food, and opportunity. And she did. She is the reason why I'm standing here speaking to you today. Tradition is the transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation, or the fact of being passed on this way. Innocent traditions in African contexts include traditional medicine, music and dance, traditional costumes, and rites of passage. On that note, let's delve deeper to the term rites of passage. What does that actually mean? A rite of passage in African societies can include marriage, death, or going into adulthood. It can also include practices like female genital mutilation, forced child marriages, and other discriminatory practices based on gender. Female genital mutilation, or FGM, is a traditional harmful practice that involves the partial or total removal of the female genital organs or other injury to female genital organs for non-medical reasons. FGM happens in stages: the partial removal of the female genitalia, the total removal of the female genitalia, and infibulation, which involves the sewing of the labia majora together. Other types of FGM can also include any other harm done to the female genitalia, like burning, scraping, piercing, or cutting. It occurs in many places around the world, but most prominently in Eastern Africa. Over 4 million girls are at risk of FGM each year. 4 million. According to the UNICEF, over 230 million girls and women have been cut. Africa accounts for the largest share of this total, with over 144 million. South Asia and Southeast Asia follow with over 80 million, and a further 6 million are in the Middle East. This practice inflicts the mental and physical torture, causing lifelong trauma for girls as young as 13. It is often carried out under the pretext of making a passage into womanhood, associated with notions of social acceptance and improved marriage prospects. The idea is that it enhances a girl's eligibility to get married because of the need for modesty and purity. Religion is one of the most commonly used justifications for this practice, as well as tradition and culture. Another common explanation for this is the theory of cultural relativism. From a global politics lens, cultural relativism is a theory that ideas and other norms should reflect cultural practices and traditions rather than universal principles. Universalism, on the other hand, another global politics theory, explains that rights should be equally applicable to all people or countries and should not vary according to local cultures or religious contexts. In this case, do we side with cultural relativism and its emphasis on cultural dependency when discussing the issue of human rights, or do we apply the concept of universalism stating that all rights should be adhered to, no matter the cultural context, especially as countries ratify these documents and are expected to follow them. To what extent can states justify cultural relativism? To what extent can we defend the cultures perpetuating the constant abuse of women in Africa with the excuse of religion and cultural norms? In my opinion, cultural relativism, although inclusive to some contexts, can be extremely damaging to individuals suffering from the constant abuse based on religion or culture. Fundamentally, there is no way to be inclusive if we allow people in threatening situations to suffer under the guise of religious and cultural freedom. These two things are very important, and as an African woman who understands the complexity of generalizing and applying the Declaration of Human Rights to non-Western contexts, I also understand that human rights abuses are currently being ignored all over the world. Cultural relativism is a means for abuse and should be deeply questioned. Centuries ago, Portuguese missionaries brought Christianity to Mozambique. With that came narratives that confined women to domestic roles, normalizing the persistent mistreatment of women. Colonialism not only imposed patriarchal structures, but also contributed to the perception of women as lesser beings, disrupting our current understanding of womanhood in Africa until today. Black girls, for example, are often placed at the bottom of beauty standards, and young African girls are oblivious to the fact that they do have a voice and that it is heard. As I said before, I grew up surrounded by women, so even though I was surrounded by resilience and hard work, I often noticed the way people disregarded my mother's opinion, or how people raise their daughters with the expectation that they should remain silent in the presence of a man. I also noticed how parents would favor their sons over their daughters, letting their sons get away with things that their daughters could never be caught doing, or how they place expectations on their daughters or mentally and physically confine them for so long with the excuse of safety. This disparity led to instances of parental abuse, subtly manifesting and impacting the mental well-being of young girls, including myself. Africa is a continent of immense diversity. It is made out of a multitude of cultures, traditions, and languages. Our first step in rethinking tradition involves recognizing and embracing this diversity. What may be a cherished practice in one community might be a form of abuse in another. FGM, a tradition that has been alive for more than 1,000 years, is undoubtedly a human rights abuse. The infliction of mental and physical torture should be deemed as not only inhumane, but also illegal. Child marriage promotes the exploitation of young girls. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, every year at least 12 million girls are married off before they reach the age of 18. This is 28 girls every minute. 1 in 5 girls is married or in union before reaching the age of 18. This clearly translates to gender inequality, lack of education, and religious trauma. So why is child marriage so normalized within our societies? Marriage nowadays is often viewed as a symbol of love and commitment between two people. However, in many rural societies, marriage has historically been regarded as an economic arrangement, and it is painfully evident. Girls marry off at 16 to 25-year-old men. In this context, children would be considered the property of men, and ultimately the life of the woman herself. Only recently has marriage evolved, particularly in Western societies, to be seen as an expression of love. However, in many African societies, despite modernization, marriage continues to be perceived as an economic arrangement. It remains as a way for men to attain status as married individuals. Even when women hold positions of greater financial influence compared to their husbands, they're still viewed as lesser beings rather than being looked at as equals. This only fosters an environment where domestic abuse can thrive. This can be further worsened by the misuse of religion, with religious beliefs used as justification for abusive behavior. The abuse of women in marriages, child marriage, FGM, and many other factors cannot be put into a single box of culture, identity, and wholesome tradition when evident human rights abuses are taking place. It is impossible to justify the mental and physical torture of human beings with culture. It's time to question whether these roles empower or restrict African women. So now that I've explained to you exactly what FGM entails, as well as abuse in marriages and child marriage, and how truly horrible it can be, let us discuss. Should all African traditions and cultural norms be translated into abuse? Where do we draw the line? When do we speak up? How can we redefine traditional gender norms to ensure equality for all? Obviously, not all African traditions and cultural norms deserve to be labeled as abusive. Every cultural context around the world has questionable practices and cultural norms. And judging an entire culture based off of a singular aspect can be detrimental. Nevertheless, it is essential to acknowledge these harmful practices and norms and to question them publicly. Just because these things are happening in rural societies does not make them any less significant. The first step to ensure equality is better education. We need to raise awareness and educate communities about the impact of certain cultural practices on women. In this way, we can encourage more people to speak up against abuse and refuse any obligation to engage in any harmful activities, ensuring their security and well-being. Another crucial step involves advocacy to ensure that states recognize the importance of safeguarding women's rights. Legislation is essential. It should be mandated that those perpetuating cultural practices comprehend the rights and recognize when such practices transition from cultural norms to harmful behaviors jeopardizing human rights. We should be able to support initiatives that provide aid to individuals who have been subjected to this abuse. We should raise public awareness, involve the media, facilitate conversations, and approach institutions in power. We shouldn't be afraid to speak up about this and to acknowledge the difficulties faced by many women around the world, especially in Africa. Empowerment is a catalyst for change. We must actively empower African women to challenge, question, and reshape cultural narratives. Education, economic independence, and participation in decision-making processes are vital components of this empowerment, providing tools for women to become agents of positive change. We draw the line when human lives are being questioned. We draw the line when human beings are undergoing mental and physical torture, abuse, or anything related. Rethinking tradition requires a delicate balance between cultural sensitivity and awareness. My aim is not to erase or to condemn all of our cultural heritage, but to evolve it thoughtfully. As an African woman, I greatly understand the sensitivity and implications of condemning cultural and religious practices without any basis. I understand. But I also understand that one of the implications of this is a continual discrimination of African women. By fostering open dialogues that acknowledge the value of our traditions while addressing these harmful aspects, we can shape a more equitable future. It is our responsibility to rethink our role in society as individuals and for young people to reshape perspectives and influence our generation. Being an African woman is a multifaceted identity. I hope when you look at me, at us, you can think of a future that balances both culture and equity. Thank you.